Um, Thank you, Judy. We've got a fantastic program again this morning. The first of our speakers is Michael Chase, who will be known to many people here through his translations of Pierre Hadot. Michael is, however, somebody who does many more things than just translate Hadot. He's also produced critical editions and translations of Porphyry, Ammonius, and Simplicius, and he's a senior researcher at the Centre Jean Papin at the National Centre for Scientific Research in Paris, as well as adjunct professor in the Department of Greek and Roman Studies at the University of Victoria, Canada. He's a co-editor with Eli and myself of the PWL series with Brill. And it's fantastic to be able to have Michael present this morning. I don't have your title in front of me, Michael, but if you share your screen,
sure,
take it away.
I'll do that. Thanks so much, Matt, for the invitation and for the wonderful organization of this conference. All right, then. So let me get back to the correct starting screen. It's called Spectator Novus, on seeing and continuing to see the world as if for the first time. And I'd like to dedicate this talk to the students and teachers of the Department of Philosophy of the Menshikov National University, Odessa, Ukraine, who have never stopped teaching despite the barbarities of the war they're currently undergoing. So what this is about then is the phenomenon of the fact that we get bored. There's few more famous definitions of philosophy than the one by Plato and Aristotle, from which, according to which, philosophy arises from wonder, thauma. But how can we maintain this kind of wonder? How can we preserve this wonder? After all, this kind of wonder tends not to last. Right? We get bored with the object of our initial wonder, and the more we become used to a person, thing, or event, the less we're likely to pay attention to it. The less we're amazed by it. How can we counteract what Diskin Clay has called this numbing effect of familiarity and view the world once again with the same vividness and freshness as if we were seeing it for the first time? Hadot likes to quote this passage from the letters of Lucilius of Seneca. For me, at least, the contemplation of wisdom itself absorbs much of my time. I am no less astonished when I gaze in it than I sometimes am by the world itself, which I often see as if for the first time. Now note that Seneca here says sometimes and often. So this kind of implies that even for Seneca, this condition of being amazed or stupefied, ob stupefactus, by the world's beauty was not even his default state of awareness. And I think that a fortiori, this was probably true of most non-philosophers in antiquity, as it is of most people today. Both in antiquity and now, most people were not very much inclined to pay attention to what is usual or customary. Another text that Hadot likes to cite is this one from Lucretius, who offers us a thought experiment. He asks himself, what would be our impression if we suddenly saw the world around us for the first time? Lucretius writes, there is nothing again so great or so wonderful that all human beings do not gradually diminish their wonder at it. In the first place, consider the clear and pure color of the sky and all that it contains, the traveling constellations, the moon, and the bright light of the dazzling sun. If all these were now revealed for the first time to mortals, what more wonderful than these things could be named? Nothing, I think, so wondrous the spectacle would have been. Yet think how all are so wearied with satiety of seeing that no one now thinks it worthwhile to look up towards the bright vault of heavens. So even in Lucretius's day, then, he is shocked by the fact that his fellow citizens can't even be bothered to look up at the night sky, despite the fact that if they, according to his thought experiment, if they had to see it, if they did see it for the first time, they would consider it miraculously beautiful. So basically what the ancients can teach us on this subject is that we are naturally attracted to what's novel and unusual and pay intense attention to it. But when we perceive the same phenomenon repeatedly, we become habituated to it and take it for granted. The result is that we no longer wonder or marvel at it and rapidly move on to something more interesting. But the problem with this is the end result is that we are easily bored and distracted. And this in turn can turn our life into a process of diminishing returns. Over time, we can derive less and less pleasure and intensity from the experiences of our daily life, which may eventually lead to a state of semi-consciousness, automatic pilot, and lack of gratitude. But why is this the case? Then what can we do about it? Let's go back to Pierre Hadot for a moment in his interpretation of Seneca, the Seneca passage we started out with. He writes that to see things for the first time is to rid one's glance of all that hides from it the nudity of nature, freed from all the utilitarian representations with which we cover it. It is to perceive in a naive and disinterested way, and this notion of disinterest is going to be key. An attitude that is far from being simple, since we must tear ourselves away from our habits and our egotism. So we can see the world as if for the first time, according to Hadot, only if we can escape from the domination of the ego, which makes us evaluate things as a function of the advantages or disadvantages we think they might bring to ourself. Wherein here, our self is understood as the isolated, egocentric individual we usually take ourselves to be. But now Hadot, and this is one of his most radical proposals, suggests that we may be wrong about that. There may be another self, more universal and therefore more objective, and learning to first acknowledge and then identify with that greater self may be one goal of philosophy. Let's go now to a bit of neurological considerations. At each instant, our perceptual apparatus provides our central nervous system with tremendous amounts of information about the external world. And the brain, despite its impressive processing capacities, can't possibly handle all that information. So from an evolutionary perspective, if human beings were to be able to function and survive in a dangerous world, they very quickly had to learn what information could safely be regarded as irrelevant, the number of leaves, for instance, on the tree down the street, and what information required in immediate attention, like, for instance, the cobra in the sand or the cave bear hiding behind the rock down the road. And these decisions, moreover, had to become automatic, and the results of these decisions had to be stored and made easily accessible, quickly and reliably to our memory. And in other words, we had to establish automatized attentional filters, which would enable us to quickly categorize things and events into what's relevant and hence worth paying attention to and what is not. Now, these ideas were anticipated about a century ago by Henri Bergson. Bergson already spoke of the mind's, and I quote, constant effort to limit its horizon, to turn away from it what it has a material interest in not seeing. Life demands that we put on blinkers. In the immensely vast field of our virtual knowledge, we have gathered everything that interests our direct action on objects, but we have neglected the rest. The brain seems to have been constructed with a view to this work of selection. A very prescient remark, it seems to me. So for Bergson, this system of attentional filters is necessary for our survival, but it comes at a cost. It's essential for the quick, efficient allocation of attentional resources, but these filters distort our perception because they make us look at the world from a utilitarian point of view and pay attention only to what we judge may be of particular benefit or danger to us. Bergson says elsewhere that everything else we perceive without apperceiving. In other words, this information the vast majority of the information we receive through perception does not reach our consciousness. Perception, Bergson writes, isolates out of the whole of reality that which interests us. It shows us not so much the things themselves as the profit we can gain from them. It classifies and tags them in advance. We scarcely look at an object, for it suffices us to know to which category it belongs. So as far as the mechanics of this is concerned, evolution has designed these filters to deal primarily with novelty, the occurrence of unexpected sensations or events. Now, in humans, novel events are detected by a broadly distributed network of brain regions, which work by a complex feedback network of stimulation, inhibition, and disinhibition. One of the main players in this process is the hippocampus, that tiny little seahorse-shaped organ in the middle of our brain. It has many, many functions, but one of them is to compare current sense presentations from the outside world to previous ones. Now, if these presentations match, that is to say, if our usual expectations are met, then we don't have to pay any much further attention to the current presentation. But if there's a mismatch between our current presentation and previous presentations, then the current impression is encoded as novel and salient. Now, the central nervous system carries out this kind of encoding by means of all kinds of peptide neuromodulators. I won't go through them all, but I will concentrate here on one of them, which is beta-endorphin, an endogenous opioid. By the way, another key point to make is that all these neurotransmitters involved in this process are subject to habituation. In other words, to achieve the same effect over time, it takes more and more of them. So beta-endorphin may be conceivably be partly responsible for these positive impressions we sometimes get when we experience novelty. Like when we first come to a foreign city, we sometimes feel an impression of freshness, stimulation, and heightened perception. We pay more attention to things than we do back home, and everything seems more vivid. Now, some of these positive effects may therefore be partly due to the release by the hippocampus of beta-endorphin and other endogenous opioids. And they may therefore be one of the possible sources of the feelings of wonder and awe we experience when seeing things for the first time, and sometimes even when we imagine seeing things for the first time, as in Lucretius's thought experiment. Now, these pleasant sensations, these positive sensations, may be nature's way of engraving novel experiences deep within our memory, tagging them, and making sure that we remember them by making them salient. However, nature has no interest in making such impressions last. On the contrary, if an experience is to be salient and marked as worthy of special attention, it must stand out against a background of non-salient, ordinary experiences to which we pay less attention. So, novelty and habituation or familiarity are thus two sides of the same coin. In the long run, we can't have one without the other. The psychologist Daniel Siegel has some interesting analyses of these themes. According to him, there are two basic layers of our processing of the experience of reality. One he calls bottom up. In this, we leave ourselves open like a conduit to sensory experience, to perceptual experience. And the other part is top down, in which our cognitive apparatus acts as a constructor, creating mental models, generalizations, and categorizations on the basis of our previous experience. For instance, if we have seen a bunch of dogs, then the next time something comes along that answers to the description of a furry, four-footed animal that barks, we immediately classify it as a dog, and we don't pay much intense attention to it anymore, and we overlook some of the details that make it unique. And this applies, according to Siegel, to all our experience, which ends up as an amalgam of top-down and bottom-up experience. Siegel contrasts this case with the case of seeing an anteater, assuming we haven't seen one before. This new experience will immediately capture all our attention, engaging our bottom-up processing so that we are, quote unquote, quoting Siegel, seeing with beginner's eyes. Because in this case, our top-down filtering has not yet intervened to alter and to limit our perceptual experience. So in this sense, habituation, or the gradual diminishment of the attention we pay to new things, can be understood as top-down dominance. Returning to Pierre Hadot, what does Pierre Hadot have to say about it? Well, as we've seen, nature doesn't really want this feeling of novelty to last forever. And so there's therefore some degree of increasing boredom and habituation to our surroundings seems inevitable. This doesn't mean that the deadening effects of habituation can't be temporarily and selectively attenuated. Even if nature doesn't want us to be able to experience all events as equally novel and amazing all the time, there may be some ways of temporarily and artificially reproducing this experience of freshness and novelty that we have when we see the world as if for the first time. Now, Pierre Hadot discusses two closely related methods to achieve this goal, drawn from ancient and modern philosophy respectively, concentration on the present and aesthetic perception. And I'm going to argue that there may be another method which Hadot does not discuss, mindfulness meditation. So we're coming into familiar territory now for those of us who have read a bit of Pierre Hadot. Hadot writes with regard to concentration on the present that by freeing ourselves from our usual obsession with regrets about the past and worries about the future, or fears about the future, and focusing exclusively on the present, we can fully enjoy the wealth of each instant, which is also a symbol and a summary of the infinite value of the existence of the world. And Hadot was struck by the fact that this exercise was recommended by two very opposed Hellenistic philosophical schools, the Stoics and the Epicureans. So these ideas are based on axioms that happiness can only be found in the present, that one instant of happiness is equivalent to an eternity of happiness, that happiness must be found immediately here and now. And the goals include those of resituating the present instant within the perspective of the entire cosmos, and I'm sorry. And realizing the way that it fits into the entire cosmos. Now, since the present instance on this understanding is our only point of contact with reality, it can be imagined as a passage and a metamorphosis. And for Hadot, by espousing the movement of the coming into being of the world, we can, as to quote him, participate in the overall movement of the event of the world and the reality of the world's coming to be. And this espousing of the world's creative movement is crucial for the aesthetic method for reactualizing the experience of seeing the world for the first time. Now, Hadot mentions this notion of aesthetic consciousness because this state of cosmic consciousness that spiritual exercises have as their goal may be hard to achieve today because the ancient recipes for achieving cosmic consciousness are based on some assumptions. For instance, in the case of the Stoics, the existence of a providential cosmos governed by universal reason that may be hard for us to share in the 21st century. So therefore, Hadot proposes the aesthetic option, according to which some 20th century artists and their philosophical commentators claim that aesthetic perception can be a model for philosophical perception and hence for cosmic consciousness. According to Bergson, once again, aesthetic perception can lead us to a transformation, a conversion, as our speakers yesterday reminded us, that lets us break from our habitual modes of perception in which we see and evaluate the world as a function of what it means for us and achieve a state of being able to see the world qua world, as it is in itself, independently of its relation to us. So in this sense, modern art, despite its lack of being representational, can help us achieve an objective view of reality as it really is. Because it is disinterested and detached, this new way of seeing is stripped of the egocentric blinders that usually filter our utilitarian perception of the world. So these philosophers urge us to transform our perception of the world and no longer see it as a set of objects, each of which is defined by its value to us. Instead, by either aesthetic perception or phenomenological reduction, we are to relearn how to see the world. So once again, we come up with this idea of detachment. This detached, disinterested approach to the world may help us achieve cosmic consciousness. Now I want to talk about something related but slightly different, mystical or peak experiences, as Maslow called them. These experiences are novel in at least two senses. They often occur suddenly and unexpectedly without warning, and they can also be triggered by the sudden occurrence of seemingly innocuous events. But they often have a transformative effect on a person's view of the world, making it appear vivid, fresh, and new, novel, as in the ancient descriptions of imagining we are seeing the world for the first time. Back in the early 1900s, William James spoke of the objective change which the world seems to undergo in such experiences. An appearance of newness beautifies every object. This sense of clean and beautiful newness within and without is one of the commonest entries in records of religious conversions. And now I want to turn to the testimony of a medical doctor and Zen practitioner, James Austin, who is close to 100 years old and keeps on writing. He writes that Zen practitioners who undergo the peak experience known as Kensho or Satori are struck by something completely new. Austin describes at great length and meticulously his own experience of having the experience of Kensho in a London railway station. This experience was prepared for by a slight change in his schedule. He got up a little earlier. He went to see a new place he'd never been before. And suddenly he achieved an experience of absolute rightness, absolute reality, intrinsic rightness and ultimate perfection. Now, the elements that Austin emphasizes in his descriptions are interesting, I think. He emphasizes the absence or irrelevance of a viewing self, feelings of timelessness, absence of fear, ineffability, and gratitude. But above all, Austin writes, this view was objective. So when we compare Austin's characteristics of the experience of Kensho and Zen, this illuminatory experience, with some of the experiences that Pierre Hadot describes, we see an awful lot of elements in common, it seems to me. The elements in common include novelty in the form of seeing the world as if for the first time, absence of fear, gratitude, detachment, and objectivity. And I think it's this objectivity that's key, because for both Austin and Hadot, detachment and objectivity presuppose that we free ourselves from the egocentric default perspective according to which the world revolves around us. And what we are supposed to become detached from is the false perspective, according to which we view ourselves as isolated individuals in a world that is largely alien and hostile to us. So what might be I'm going to argue there may be a third way of seeing the world as if for the first time. And here I want to return to the views of Daniel Siegel, the psychologist. Siegel describes an experience in which he fell off a horse and banged his head and therefore suffered a kind of temporary amnesia for about 24 hours. During this time, he writes that he enjoyed the tastes of water or a mango, for instance, as if for the first time, without those sensations being filtered through the lens of prior experience. In other words, these attentional filters that we were talking about. Gradually, as his personal identity began to return, he writes, the water felt more distant, the mango became a mango. Instead of experiencing the fullness of the fruit, I was prone to experience the limits of language. Whereas when he was living with this amnesia, the diminished sense of personal identity, he experienced the world in a way that, as he writes, was akin to seeing things for the first time. Now, a brief mention about a pioneering scholar in the study of mystical experiences named Dijkman, who way back in 1966 spoke in terms of de-automatization. And by that, he meant something similar to the disactivation of these attentional filters that Siegel and others have talked about. So de-automatization is the reversal of this process of sorting that is carried out by our attentional filters. And Dijkman argues that when this occurs, when de-automatization can occur by what he calls contemplative meditation. And the result of this is that the world seems to us to be more vivid, sensuous, and animated, and is marked by a reduced feeling of the distinction between subject and object. And like Siegel, Dijkman already speaks of the experience of receiving a new brilliance to the world, or of seeing everything as if for the first time. Now, recent studies have shown that this kind of de-automatization can be promoted by mindfulness meditation. By mindfulness, I'm going to adopt provisionally John Kabat-Zinn's definition as placing one's attention and awareness upon the present moment, with an attitude of non-judgmental acceptance. And this, in this process, of mindfulness meditation, once again, focus on the present is the key factor in the ability of this meditation to promote de-automatization, to stop us from living on automatic pilot, roughly. Okay, Hadot has shown throughout his work that the general prognosis of the ancient philosophers of the human condition was fairly negative. They thought that most of us are unhappy most of the time. And one of the main reasons for this is that we don't enjoy the present moment. Instead, we focus on regrets about the past and desires, hopes, and fears concerning the future. And we therefore postpone our happiness, thinking that all we need to be happy is just to acquire a few more material goods or reputation and so forth. Now, this often doesn't work. Even if we achieve these goals, they tend to leave us unsatisfied and give rise to even more desires. So these philosophers argued most of us consume our lives in this fruitless search for satisfaction until death puts an end to the process. Now, and the ancient philosophers' prescription for this state of affairs was, as we well know, Pierre Hadot has pointed out, various spiritual exercises intended to attenuate this usual obsession of ours with the past and the present and focus on the wealth of the present instant instead. Now, to a certain extent, contemporary neurologists and cognitive scientists agree with some aspects of this diagnosis. Many scientists have identified one major source of human unhappiness and various psychological disorders as what they call rumination or mind wandering. And what they mean by this is the constant mental chatter that occupies our minds and often focuses on regrets about the past and worries about the future. And the prescription of these scientists is also similar to that of the ancient philosophers. To enjoy increased well-being and live fuller, more richer, more fulfilling lives, we must find a way to quiet that constant self-centered chatter of our discursive minds and view the world from a new, less egocentric perspective. Now, just back very briefly to some more neurological considerations. Contemporary scientists have identified a part of the brain that seems to be responsible for rumination, and it's called the default mode network. Here on the left, you can see the parts of the brain that are basically correlated with rumination. One in the medial prefrontal part of the brain, and another back in the posterior cingulate. Now, the functions of this default mode network, which is metabolically active all the time, even when we're asleep or resting, are still imperfectly understood, but they seem to include the faculties of moral reasoning, episodic memory, mind wandering, but above all, in this context, relevant for us, is that they seem to be responsible for self-oriented thought and the sense of self. Now, the activity in this default mode network, as I said, it goes on all the time, but is diminished when we focus attention on something, on a specific object. And this takes place through what's called the dorsal attention network. And there you can see on the right hand of this part of this diagram, what parts of the brain are activated by when the dorsal attention network is working. So when we try to concentrate on something, to focus our attention on something, there is a competition between this mainly egocentric rumination of the DMN, which is responsible for distraction, and the regions of the brain responsible for paying attention, known as the task positive reason, or, as I said, the dorsal attention network, or the DAN, abbreviated. So in any given case, when we want to pay attention to something, for the brain to pay attention to an external stimulus by means of the DAN, that stimulus must be salient and novel enough to interrupt the activity of the DMN. So we have a kind of a struggle going on here, a kind of a competition. And for instance, two modern neurophysiologists have argued that attentional selection, in other words, what we pay attention to, is determined by the outcome of competition between multiple and potentially biased representations of the world and of one's perception of the self in relation to the world. So I want to argue that there is some kind of reason to believe, therefore, that if what we pay attention to, which has such a potentially important outcome on our happiness and our health, both mental and physical, there is reason to believe that by changing these biased world representations and our perception of the relations between ourselves and the world, for instance, by practicing Hadotian spiritual exercises like concentration on the present or aesthetic perception in order to achieve some degree of cosmic consciousness, we can also become better at deciding where and when we shall direct our attention. So let's wrap things up. Recent scientific studies have confirmed that various forms of mindfulness meditation can bring about a reduction of mind wandering or rumination and of default mode network activity in general. And this reduction may lead to a lasting base state of greater awareness of the present moment. Because it seems to promote dishabituation and attenuate automaticity, mindfulness meditation may therefore constitute a third way alongside the ancient spiritual exercises of concentration on the present moment and the modern spiritual exercise of aesthetic perception of reactualizing our experience of seeing the world as if for the first time. So I want to argue in conclusion that the combination of these three methods, concentration on the present, aesthetic perception, and mindfulness meditation, may thus provide one possible solution to the problem of how to avoid boredom, distraction, and taking for granted the miraculous beauty of the world and of life. These methods, among others, may help us to recover, albeit temporarily, the experience of awe and amazement at the existence of the world, which ancient Greco-Roman philosophers thought we would feel if we were able to look at the world as if for the first time. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael, for that fantastic presentation.
Okay, so we've got some questions. Lucas, do you want to go?
Hi. Hello. First of all, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. Unfortunately, I couldn't manage to watch all of it right now, but I already had so many things I would actually like to comment, but two things, I think there are two things that called my attention for the most. First of all, I wonder if we can think about concentration on the present in broader terms than, seeing things as for the first time, because it seems to me that there are some practices and even spiritual exercises, if we want, that while promoting concentration on the present, don't really imply seeing things as for the first time, but rather this dissolution of the ego. And this seems to me to be very clear, for instance, in those Buddhist traditions. For instance, if we think in this distinction between two sorts of meditation, which is samatha, which is more of concentration, and
Absolutely.
Vipassana has analytical meditation, which is meant to bring about this understanding that there is no ego, that everything is impermanent.
You're right.
So maybe to begin, I would like to ask you if you think we could broaden our comprehension of the means to reach concentration on the present by thinking, because this also has to do with flow. I kept thinking about flow,
Absolutely.
right? When it's not necessarily about seeing things for the first time. If you're playing a game that you're very good at, you already have played the game, you have some familiarity with it. It's not about, but it's about full immersion and forgetting yourself.
Absolutely.
In the moment. So as a first question, I would like to know what you think about
right.
that.
Well, I maybe wasn't sufficiently clear, but I certainly didn't mean to identify concentration on the moment, on the present moment, and this idea of seeing things for the first time. On the contrary, this experience we have of seeing things for the first time is one of, and I should have emphasized perhaps, only one of many effects of concentration on the present.
Yeah. No, that's probably my fault.
There's lots of ways. There's lots of ways, and in fact, I argued there are three principal ways. There are probably more of achieving this idea of experiencing the world as if for the first time. One of them is concentration on the present. The other is aesthetic perception, and the other might be mindfulness meditation. But no, I certainly didn't mean to identify them at all.
Yeah.
By the way, I have a. That's interesting that you should point out this the distinction between concentrative and what's sometimes called open meditation. I have a forthcoming paper coming out on that subject in the context of Hadot
nice.
spiritual exercises. But thanks for your question.
Thank you.
So Massimo, can you unmute yourself? Yeah. Good.
Yes, I can. Thank you. Michael, lots of things there. I mean, we could have a discussion for the next 2 hours. We don't have 2 hours.
No, because there are interesting football games going on.
Well, that too, but yeah. So a couple of things that struck me during your presentation. First of all, when you talk about you and in fact Hadot talking about aesthetic experiences, why art? Why not science? I mean, a la Carl Sagan, for instance. In fact, if we're talking about reality, it seems to me that art is really the wrong way to go, not a good direction. That's one question. And then a second one, if you have time, every time that I hear mystical-oriented talk of, absolute reality, intrinsic rightness, and all that sort of stuff, my problem detector goes up. Those to me sound more like the likely result of self-imposed hallucinations than of any special or privileged view into reality. What's your thinking on that?
Okay. The first one, of course, why not science? That's an interesting consideration. Of course, Hadot has written, particularly in his last book on Goethe, about that precisely. That Goethe, very much unlike contemporary scientists, had the idea that one of the goals of science is to transform the scientist. Indeed, he has written about that, and I think that that's an important aspect. Now, of course, a lot of science, not to say almost all science, most of science, I think, tends to be reductionist on the contrary. If you look at most books that are common today, they tend to want to reduce wonder rather than astonish it. And that's the effect they have on me, anyway. This tendency to reductionism is, I think, extremely doesn't contribute to increasing our wonder.
I agree, but that's
and speaking of reductionism, I guess an evil-minded commentator might say that you're guilty of that too by saying that mystical experience is just a hallucination. It may be, but people like Deichmann and von Weizsäcker, who was a person of a student of Heisenberg, said that, well, perhaps that's true, but perhaps on the contrary, these kinds of experiences of the dissolution of the subject-object relationship correspond to reality. That seems to be, that's one of the conclusions that some students of quantum mechanics seem to be drawing, including on some of the earliest ones like Niels Bohr and Heisenberg. So I don't know, I'm agnostic as to that regard, but I think the dismissal of mystical experience corresponds, quite frankly, more to a prejudice than to anything else.
I'm not convinced, but sure, we can have
Fair
a conversation, enough. As I said.
Great.
Okay, Laura, do you want to unmute yourself?
Thank you for that wonderful presentation. I want to apologize for missing part of it, because I was running around trying to find a stable internet connection, and I found it in the classroom, which is where I am right now. But I have a very simple question, I think, kind of inspired by something you said near the end about the DMN and the DAN are in competition, right? Like paying attention and being distracted are competing with one another. And I'm wondering if when you were looking at this neuroscience, if you were looking at it as it pertains to neurotypical individuals, or if this is something that's common to neurotypical and neurodiverse individuals. And if not, I mean, if we're just kind of looking at neurotypicality, if you think that those who are neurodiverse have special or different obstacles that they have to work to get over or to get around in order to have this concentration and aesthetic perception and spiritual exercises. In other words, how is this dealing with neurodiversity, since we are bringing in some of those neurological studies into the conversation?
Mm-hmm. Well, we're getting into dangerous territory here. Dangerous because I'm not an expert on this. I'm an amateur, strict amateur in neurophysiology and neurosciences. I have no formal training in it whatsoever. But I can tell you that from what I've read, among the many benefits of that have been touted for mindfulness meditation is that it can help with a certain help alleviate certain neurophysiological disorders. One of them is schizophrenia. And similarly, excess activity of the default mode network has been brought into conjunction with schizophrenia and with all kinds of other disorders, from anxiety and depression to PTSD and to what have you. So I would think that, and here again, I don't want to sound like a doctor here. I can't speak with any authority, but the literature seems to me to indicate that this diminishing of activity, regulating activity of the default mode network might have positive health outcomes on a variety of neuro-challenged people. That's what it seems to me as an amateur.
In our present moment, albeit in a more organizational mode, we're at 30 minutes, so I'm inclined to ask Doug to present his question, and Tom, for you to perhaps put it into the chat for Michael to respond, because I do want to move to John.
Yeah, it's in the chat already. Thanks, Matthew.
Yep, thanks. Doug?
What immediately struck me in your presentation was the ninth mode of Anisodemus, which is a Tyrannist mode where you question how things, your perception, based on whether it is something that is novel to you or something that you are habituated to. And I can view this in sort of as a plateau, a continuous asking of, what is this? What is this? I was wondering if you had looked into anything like this.
Yeah, I'm not sure that your connection doesn't seem to be all that great. I'm not sure that I fully understood you, but the now as far as the what is it? Yeah, that's in fact it's been argued that the questions of what is it, there's an entire neural pathway that seems to be devoted to the what is it pathway, and that is quite different from another pathway which investigates how things are situated with regards to ourselves. And some people like James Austin have argued that this what is it pathway is a more of an allocentric, it's a more of an other-oriented view on reality, and whereas the egocentric would be not so much the what pathway as the where pathway, which studies things as they are relative to ourselves. And so he wants to argue that certain types of mindfulness meditation, Zen meditation, can cause us to develop this allocentric pathway, this neural pathway by which we ask precisely this question, what is it, as opposed to what is that to us? So I think it's interesting that at least some scholars, some scientists seem to think that these questions are very different, so much so that they are correlate with different neural networks.
Michael, thank you so much again for that fascinating presentation, which I think is really breaking new ground in terms of PWL research, in terms of bringing it into discussion with these discourses surrounding the brain and so on. So thank you once again. Please join me virtually.
Thank you so much.
Our next speaker, again, will perhaps need little introduction to many people here. John Sellars is a a leader in the field of philosophy as a way of life. He's a leader in the field also of modern Stoicism. His most recent works include a work on Epicureanism as a way of life, but also a fascinating study which has just appeared on an obscure medieval figure, one Balaam of Seminara, who wrote a work on Stoic ethics, and I know that work has also just appeared. But John is going to be talking to us today on work that he's done on Renaissance humanism as a way of life, although from his slides I think the title may have changed. John, the floor is yours.
That's great. Thank you, Matt, and for putting this all together, and to everyone else who's presented so far. I'm just going to see if I can share my screen so you can see some slides. So I hope you can all see this. So yeah, as you can see, my title is Scholarship as a Philosophical Way of Life. And I want to talk about the Renaissance humanist Leon Battista Alberti. These days, Alberti is probably best remembered as someone who wrote a treatise about painting that outlined the principles of perspective, along with writing treatises on sculpture and architecture. And he was also a practicing architect during the Renaissance. And beyond the visual arts, he wrote on a wide range of topics, from grammar to mathematics. And this wide range of interests led Jakob Burckhardt, Nietzsche's old friend, famously to describe Alberti as the quintessential universal man of the Renaissance, the archetypal Renaissance figure. When we think about the term Renaissance today, I suspect we probably associate it with two different things. One, a key moment in the history of art, and two, the rediscovery of a whole range of ancient works of literature and philosophy by the Renaissance humanists. And Alberti was one of the few people who had a foot in both of these worlds. But we might ask, was he also a philosopher? Now, I certainly think he was. Among his many works, he wrote a number of philosophical dialogues, including the Theogenius and the Profugia. The former is a work of consolation, and the latter is a work of philosophical therapeutics, both drawing mainly on Stoic ideas, and both written not in Latin, but in Volgare, the Tuscan dialect that would later become Italian, precisely so that Alberti could reach a wide audience with these very practical works. Now, I don't want to talk about those today. What I want to talk about is a shorter, lesser known text, the De Commodis Literarum Atque Incommodis, the uses and disadvantages of letters, or as Watkins renders it in her translation, the use and abuse of books. Now, this was a text that Alberti wrote when he was still relatively young, perhaps 25. He just completed his studies in law at the University of Bologna. And before that, as a teenager, he'd studied with a famous humanist, Gasparino Basizza, in Padua. And Basizza gave lectures on a wide range of ancient texts, including Seneca's letters, which were a particular favorite of his. And he wrote a commentary on Seneca's letters too. And it's likely from Basizza that Alberti gained his knowledge and appreciation of Stoicism. Now, this text by Alberti, the De Commodis, has been read in a number of different ways. A number of commentators have suggested that it's either an ultimately pessimistic text, or it's one that expresses Alberti's deep ambivalence towards humanism. Now, what I want to do is approach it from a slightly different perspective. I'm going to suggest that it's in many ways a humorous text, a work of satire, but like most works of satire, one that's trying to make a serious point. Now, it's worth noting that Alberti wrote a number of works of comedy. His very first piece of writing, composed when he was just 20 years old and still a student, was a play the Philodoxius, modelled on the ancient comedies of Plautus and Terence. He also wrote a series of comic dialogues, often touching on philosophical topics, short pieces that intended to be read over dinner, and that are, in English are known as the dinner pieces, which were modelled on the satirical dialogues of Lucian. And in the preface to book one of these dinner pieces, written just after he wrote the De Commodis, and addressed to the physician Paolo Toscanelli, Alberti says that just as Paolo has a range of medicines for the body, Alberti is now going to offer in his writings some medicine for the mind. He says, I, through my writings, provide a way of relieving the mind's maladies, which works through laughter and hilarity. And similarly, in the preface to his comic novel, Momus, written a little over a decade later, he suggests that his aim in that work is to equip his readers to enjoy a better life, instructing them with weighty sayings and varied and choice material, while at the same time charming them with laughter, pleasing them with jokes, and diverting them with pleasure. Now, it's in the light of these comments that I suggest we approach the De Commodis. It's a work of satire in which Alberti pokes fun at men of letters, which is to say, at himself as much as anyone else. But as well as being humorous, it also, I suggest, wants to achieve a serious and ultimately philosophical goal. So, what I'm about to talk about is a work of comedy. It should make you laugh, or at least it should make you smile. In fact, it might make you cry, as we'll see in a moment. But it's not something that I think we should take too seriously. So the De Commodis is addressed to Alberti's brother, Carlo. And in it, he describes how he has dedicated his life to scholarship, guided by the great writers of antiquity, reading and writing every day. And here scholarship translates literis, which one might render as letters, as in the phrase man of letters, or books, or more broadly, the study of texts. And as we'll see, Alberti has all types of book learning in mind, whether that be the study of literature, philosophy, theology, or law. Many people enter into this kind of study, he suggests, under the misapprehension that it will either be enjoyable or it will improve their future career prospects. Alberti is warning his brother against holding any such expectations. Now, there are three things in particular that Alberti thinks students naively expect to gain from their studies: pleasure, money, and social prestige. He argues that in all these cases, they're mistaken. In the light of his own experience of being a student over the past decade, Alberti has learned the hard way that a life devoted to scholarship brings none of these things. And in order to demonstrate this, he addresses each one in turn. So let's do this. Let's start with pleasure. The life of the scholar, Alberti says, is necessarily hard and harsh. It's a life of constant hard work, never free of anxiety and striving. The principal task, as we all know, is reading, and this is time intensive, leaving little time over for relaxation or for going on vacation. If the scholar tries to take a break from their work, they're unlikely to enjoy it because they'll just be thinking about the unending amount of work waiting to be done at home, all those journal articles you haven't got round to yet. The more the scholar makes progress, the more they will become aware of how much they still do not know. The scholarly life thus quickly becomes an endless treadmill, and there is never any sense of finality or completion. The work is literally endless. As an aside, we might note that this was written in about 1430, so before the invention of printing and before the exponential explosion in the number of books in the second half of the 15th century. So even in the era of manuscripts, there was this perception that there was always just too much to read. The relentless time demands of the scholarly life, together with the often obsessive nature of the work, makes it largely incompatible with a meaningful social life or developing any romantic relationships, Alberti says, both of which are equally time-consuming and distracting. and so probably best avoided by any serious students. In any case, there are few opportunities for those sorts of things, given that most of the scholar's time is going to be spent in solitude in the library. Although there may be some pleasure gained from the process of study, it's significantly outweighed by its many pains. The scholar is, Alberti says, sedentary all the time, reading all the time, thinking hard, always alone, renouncing festivities and play. And don't forget the backache that comes from being hunched over your desk all day. The life of the scholar is also one of poverty. Most students have little money, and what they do have must be spent on books. Little is left over even for basic luxuries that might make life a little more comfortable. Its demand for constant productivity creates the risk that the scholar might compromise their principles. If they want success and glory, they must write no matter what, even if they have nothing to say. Erudite silence is of no value to anyone. Rather than follow Socrates, who famously wrote nothing, the scholar is more likely to end up becoming like Socrates, who, in order to earn a living, resorted to writing works praising tyrants. Just asking questions like Socrates won't cut it if you need to make a living. It can also lead to serious harms to health through overwork, lack of sleep, anxiety, depression. Alberti hints that he suffered himself in this manner, as he comments at one point, "The scholar's daily anxiety is perpetual and immense." And indeed, in his own autobiographical Vita, written a few years later, Alberti describes more than one episode of illness that he suffered brought on by overwork. And part of the problem, he suggests, is that all this effort goes into something that only has a vague and uncertain sense of future reward. Fame, glory, money, promotion, tenure. Over time, the scholar comes to realize that they're deluded and that these rewards are mere mirages. No success is ever going to come their way. Now, other career paths offer a much surer route to financial and social success, often with less effort, as many aspiring academics come to learn when they finally decide to quit the job market. However, once someone has gone so far into the world of scholarship, it soon becomes all they know, and so there's nothing else that they're qualified to do. The scholar, no matter how unhappy he might be, is all too often trapped. Thus, Alberti concludes, many people who embark on a scholarly life become alienated from their studies, they come to regret it, and given a second chance, would choose anything else. No prudent person, he comments, will be lured into it by the hope of pleasure. So summing up his case against the claim that a scholarly life is pleasurable, he writes, "The scholar neither physically nor mentally ever or hardly ever gets any rest. Bleak solitude, hard labor, endless hours, great anxiety, difficult questions, total absorption, intense anxiety. As there is no pleasure to be found in this man, so in his whole life there is almost no break in the onslaught of work and worry." And I hope you're all fully identifying with this. Okay, so much for pleasure. Alberti next turns to the issue of financial reward. If one ever meets a wealthy scholar, he comments, they must have already been wealthy because they certainly didn't gain it from their time studying books. Scholarship does not pay. The obsessive behavior that it encourages leads most scholars to neglect all of their practical matters, including their finances. What money they do have must be spent on books and the paraphernalia of academic life, graduation gowns and the like. Yet despite all this expense, which is often justified as an investment against future earnings, the student's studies are unlikely to generate any adequate income. Indeed, the costs associated with study are so great that they are rarely fully recouped by a subsequent career as a scholar, if that is, the student is fortunate enough to have one, as those of you in America burdened with outrageous levels of student debt can attest. Thus, book learning is not of the slightest use for gaining wealth, but just the opposite, a great financial drain. Indeed, few will even have a chance to earn anything at all from all their hard work. Writing in the 15th century, Alberti estimates that out of 1,000 people, maybe only 100 or so will survive to that point in middle age where they will ever be qualified enough to make a living from their scholarly work. And we might note that famous humanists such as Pico della Mirandola died at the age of just 31, and Angelo Poliziano died at the age of 40. Out of those 100 that will actually make it to middle age, out of those 100 that will make it to middle age, it may be that only 10 or so will actually be intellectually gifted enough to produce good enough work, Alberti suggests, and have a shot at an academic career. And of those 10, perhaps only 3 will have the strength of character required to keep going in the face of the many challenges they will face on the academic job market. For the 1 or 2 that might actually succeed in earning a living from their studies and gain tenure, this won't be due to their innate genius or all their hard work. It will just be a product of the stupidity of fortune. If those 1 or 2 go on to achieve worldly success through their studies, fame, promotion, the celebrity academic, they're highly unlikely to be praiseworthy individuals given the compromises they'll inevitably have to make along the way. Thus, anyone who pursues the scholarly life in the hope of great wealth, or even just making a modest living, is, Alberti says, extremely foolish. Having said all that, Alberti acknowledges that there are some exceptions. There are some branches of study that naturally lead on to careers, and he mentions law, medicine, and business administration. So not much has changed. And later on, he also adds theology as a potential career path. However, those who devote themselves to the liberal arts won't have those kinds of careers open to them. Writers and philosophers work just as hard, but see no financial reward for their efforts. Instead, they will be forced to go around begging for teaching positions, he says, the life of the modern adjunct. But Alberti quips, what should one expect? After all, philosophers despise wealth as an ultimate evil, so they deserve to be penniless and wretched, he comments. Alongside financial reward, Alberti suggests that many students also wrongly believe that their studies will bring them social prestige and honor, the glory of being called doctor or professor. However, he argues that the scholar is universally held in low esteem precisely because most people can see the hardship, poverty, and constant work of the scholarly life, and so can't comprehend why anyone in their right mind would choose to follow it. The scholar neglects all the things that are usually thought to be essential for a happy life, their finances, their family, their health. And so the average person is unlikely to consider a scholar very wise at all. As time goes on, the scholar is likely to become increasingly resentful of the fact that all their hard work has not brought them any money or prestige. If they go back out into the world where these things are valued above all else, it's unsurprising that some scholars will start to desire these things: money, prestige, grant income, promotion, more than they do the pursuit of knowledge. As Alberti puts it, quote, "If your clothes are fancy, you are highly honored. And as we all know, only senior management in universities can afford designer labels." But some scholars don't fall into this trap. They remain committed to the study of their subjects and the pursuit of knowledge in their field. The problem that these individuals face, however, is that when they find themselves in social situations in the wider world, they tend to let forth with excessive passion about whatever it is they're obsessively working on, to the bemusement of their audience. Quickly, they become objects of ridicule. Consequently, the true scholar also is rarely admired in the wider world. Pulling these threads together, Alberti summarizes his satirical account of the scholarly life by commenting that in devotion to books, you will find much work, no pleasures, great expense, little profit, many difficulties, and very little authority. The scholarly life then fails to deliver pleasure, wealth, or fame. I noted earlier that Alberti had spent time studying with the famous humanist teacher Bazitza, and it was no doubt then that Alberti became acquainted with the ideas of the Stoics, to which he seems to have been quite sympathetic. Indeed, a number of commentators have characterized Alberti as a Stoic. And for the Stoics, of course, these three things, pleasure, wealth, and fame, are far from essential for a good life. Pleasure is classified as a harmful emotion to be avoided, while wealth and fame are counted as preferred indifference, things that might be chosen over their opposites, but are not required in order for us to attain happiness. If Alberti was indeed sympathetic to the Stoics, then we might expect him to question whether the pursuit of these things is in fact appropriate. There are a number of hints in this direction early on in Alberti's text. When arguing that the scholarly life won't bring pleasure, money, or fame, he often adds as an aside that what it will bring is knowledge. Yet this is, of course, the key to understanding the true benefits of a life devoted to books. As Alberti comments, the prudent student will read his text as a valuable reminder that books can give them true guidance and real understanding of things, while all the rest is not worth thinking about. He later elaborates on what he means by knowledge by specifying knowledge of human and divine things, a guide to good conduct, and knowledge of the best things in life. All these come from, he says, philosophy, the mother of learning. Alongside knowledge, Alberti also points to other things that we do gain from study, namely wisdom and virtue. At one point he states, what we gain from study is, I quote, modesty, magnanimity, virtue, and wisdom. While at another point, he says that the goals of the scholar ought to be, I quote, peace of mind, good conduct, virtue, and wisdom, adding that these are what the liberal arts aim at. There's also, he suggests, a therapeutic benefit. One of the reasons why people ought to engage in scholarship, he comments, is in order to improve one's own mind. It brings, he says, peace of mind and stability of character. The liberal arts that the scholar devotes his time to are meant to cure and eliminate diseases of the spirit, such as avarice, greed, and lust, and to develop and strengthen in the soul which inclines towards evil, a love of liberty, a sense of honor, nobility of spirit, and disdain for transitory things. In other words, they're supposed to cure the vices and cultivate the virtues. The true scholar comes to realize that this kind of learning is in fact more valuable than pleasure or worldly success. They have made the choice to pursue knowledge rather than cash, as Alberti puts it, character rather than precious metals, and a richly furnished mind rather than a richly furnished home. Here one can see Alberti's text take a shift in tone. The mockery of the naive scholar is replaced with a more serious defense of the importance of virtue. However, the humor is not entirely absent. Alberti jokes that it's a good job that the scholarly life offers these benefits, because these are precisely the things the scholar will need in order to be able to cope with all of the hardships that he's already described. Alberti also comments that when he first embarked on his life as a scholar, he certainly did not have all this already in mind. His own pursuit of scholarship was shaped by a desire for knowledge, but also a desire for worldly success, he comments. And this is where he went wrong. Through both the study of Stoic philosophical ideas and his own hard-won experience of the realities of scholarly life, he came to realize that it was a mistake to pursue both of these ends at once. His study of Stoicism taught him that worldly success was not a worthwhile goal because it is not inherently good, and it is also something out of one's control. While his lived experience taught him that a life of scholarship was highly unlikely to deliver it. Alberti's text then might be described as a reflection on what the appropriate telos ought to be for someone tempted by living the scholarly life. Throughout his text, there are warnings against pursuing both ends, knowledge and worldly success. Alberti exhorts the scholar to, quote, flee from those false values of money, vain fame, and corrupt popularity that you introduce into scholarly work. Equally damaging is let the affairs of the world interfere with scholarly leisure. And so Alberti counsels scholars to avoid at all costs administrative work. He emphatically states that, quote, nothing is worth pursuing except wisdom and virtue. The prudent scholar knows that this is the true purpose of study, and knowing this, they happily bear the pain and poverty of the scholarly life for the sake of these higher goods. They will also know that, according to although the wider world may not pay them much respect, they nevertheless ought to rank above all other men due to their commitment to excellent morals and wisdom. Now, Alberti is all too aware that he lives in a world where people are admired for their wealth, but few are admired for their virtue. But echoing Aristotle, Alberti comments that if humans are natural pursuers of knowledge, then the scholar, insofar as they fulfill this function, is in fact the most perfect human being there is. By the end of the De Commodis, the mockery of the scholarly life is firmly set to one side. And although Alberti comments that when he first started out on his own scholarly life, he had his eye on worldly success alongside the pursuit of knowledge, now he is, quote, consistently on the side of virtue. He has coped with hardship, poverty, and hostility, all for the sake of his love of learning, pursuing it not for pleasure or for money, but for the knowledge that will help him traverse life's adversities. These then are the true benefits of a life devoted to scholarship. And in my title, I suggested that we ought to see this as a philosophical way of life. Indeed, as an instance of philosophy as a way of life. Let me try to justify that claim a little more. Despite a number of commentators doubting Alberti's philosophical credentials, it seems fairly clear that when Alberti talks in this text about letters, scholarship, and books, he has philosophy in mind. It's true that he mentions other academic disciplines such as law, medicine, and business administration, but he places these in a lower category of study because they aim at some external practical goal rather than something that's an end in itself. Whenever he defines the ultimate goal of scholarly activity, as we have seen, he usually defines it as either wisdom or virtue. It is also supposed to be something that brings peace of mind. These are all the domains of philosophy. And at one point, Alberti refers to philosophy as the mother of all arts, standing above all other arts, but also encompassing all intellectual activity. And in this, he was probably following a well-known definition of philosophy in Cicero that was popular among humanists at the time, including his own teacher Barsiza. For in his De Oratore, Cicero had written, I quote, "The most learned men hold what the Greeks call philosophia to be the creator and mother, as it were, of all reputable arts." So, when Alberti is talking about book learning, he's thinking about studying Cicero, whose philosophical works he often draws on, and Seneca, who he quotes in a number of his other works, and also Diogenes Laertius, whose lives of the philosophers Alberti knew well. Indeed, it's been suggested that Alberti's own short autobiography that I mentioned earlier was modelled on the biographies that he had read in Diogenes Laertius. Unusually for an autobiography, Alberti's piece is written in the third person. Along with an account of his life, which is presented as a series of anecdotes, it also includes a series of sayings, just as one finds in Diogenes' biographies of the ancient philosophers. Some have suggested that Alberti's autobiography was modelled in particular on Diogenes' life of Thales, while others have pointed to the influence of the life of Diogenes the Cynic. Either way, this looks to be Alberti consciously wanting to present himself as a philosopher and choosing to do so through an account of his own way of life. In his autobiography, he describes how he was always examining his own conduct, down to every gesture and every word. In the face of the various adversities that befell him in his own life, he comments that he responded to these difficulties by cultivating his virtue. And he also describes the ways in which he engaged in both physical and mental training, echoing passages in the life of Diogenes the Cynic. Just as Diogenes had famously embraced marble statues in winter in order to strengthen his resilience, Alberti describes similar training that he undertook in order to overcome his own aversion to the cold. So it seems then that Alberti was keen to present himself as a philosopher, and in particular, as a philosopher in the mold of someone like Diogenes the Cynic, who'd lived a very distinctive way of life. In Alberti's own scholarly studies, he both learned arguments about why virtue is the highest good and encountered these vivid examples of what living a philosophical life devoted to virtue might actually look like. For him, the scholar who studies philosophy and the other liberal arts is learning nothing less than, I quote, the foundation and pillars of a good and happy life. And this is in marked contrast to scholastic philosophers who, elsewhere, Alberti lampoons for being tied up by linguistic subtleties. Okay, so let me start to pull some of these threads together. In his translator's introduction to Alberti's famous treatise on painting, John Spencer commented that it would be an exaggeration to dignify Alberti with the title of philosopher. Certainly he had no system. Now it's the last part of this statement that's telling. He had no system. For someone who thinks that philosophy is about developing systems, then Alberti might indeed not look like much of a philosopher. But for someone who thinks that philosophy is about learning how to live a good life, I think Alberti certainly does look like one. As we've seen, the De Commodis is only a short text and in part simply a joke at Alberti's own expense and equally at ours. However, it does two important things. First, it reflects seriously on Alberti's own lived experience and the way of life to which he had committed himself. Is this a worthwhile way to live? As noted earlier, Alberti suffered more than one bout of serious mental illness as a result of his overwork, as many scholars continue to do today. And this no doubt raised serious and urgent questions about whether this really was the right way for him to live. Second, it responds to this serious question by drawing on Stoic ideas from the books he'd been studying in order to engage in a process of value clarification. What is the highest good? What's worth pursuing? What is the telos of this scholarly way of life? And is it compatible with human happiness? By going through this process of philosophical therapy, Alberti comes to see that much of his suffering was caused by his own multiple and conflicting motivations for embracing this scholarly way of life, trying to pursue both knowledge and worldly success at the same time. By accepting that it's not only unrealistic, to expect external goods such as money and status from a life devoted to scholarship, but also philosophically mistaken to pursue such ends, Alberti is able to move beyond the internal conflict and disappointment that led to his own mental suffering, and instead to focus on goals that matter most and are within his own control, namely knowledge for his own sake and developing a virtuous character. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Okay. Thank you so much for introducing us to that fascinating text. There's been some discussion in the chat as you've been going, John. People have scandalously suggested Alberti's text might have contemporary relevance, an opinion, of course, which we can all disagree with heartily. So questions either by hands up or virtual hands up, please.
Thomas had his hand up just a moment ago. Thomas Brockerman.
Tom? Is that correct?
No, actually not. This was clapping. I think it was the clap. I think I got it right.
Others?
Eli,
Yep.
Thanks for a lovely talk. As I was mentioning in the chat to another colleague, the more you read of Renaissance, humanists, the more I feel empathetic and impressed for their self-awareness about the scholarly life in a way I think often isn't. We're both keenly aware but inarticulate of besides our private conversations. This is an undeveloped question. I was waiting to respond to hopefully be able to articulate it better, but since no one else was getting things going, I thought I would start, which is I was just really interested in, how do I say it, the kind of development from Renaissance humanists like Alberti thought about the dangers of the scholarly life to it being a pathology. I've been kind of recently playing around with both, Matthew Sharp's work on the kind of literature on academic vices, but even then Ansi Vila's one on suffering scholars and the kind of pathologies, the idea in the Enlightenment that even the scholarly life might be a pathology, or at least leads to kind of what we would call, psychosis, or at least general stress and anxiety disorders. So my question to you for Alberti is, I know he thinks if you get into it to the right reasons, you can kind of reorganize yourself to get the benefits of the scholarly life without being disappointed about the dangers of it. But like, how much does he think, or how much is already within his thought concerned that the scholarly life itself leads to bad habits versus our attitude to how we practice the scholarly life in a kind of stoic, cynic mentality is the issue, if that makes sense. In other words, where does the scholarly life lead to bad behavior versus our kind of intentionality towards it in a stoic, cynic sensibility end?
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, I think Alberti really is a good Stoic. So there's a sense in which he's going to say, it's nothing inherent in the scholarly life. It's simply the attitude that we bring to it, right? So, it might be that a scholarly life involves all sorts of pain, poverty, physical discomfort. But right, if you don't think any of those things matter, if those are just, preferred, non-preferred indifference, then who cares, right? If you're a serious Stoic or a cynic, then those things aren't going to affect you. But as Epictetus famously said a long time ago, very few of us are actually Stoics. Most of us are Epicureans. There are a few weak Peripatetics. Most of us want to live a fairly comfortable life, and and you see that a lot with you see that a lot in contemporary academia. You see lots of people who, say that they're there because they're committed to their subject and they want to study this at all costs. And yet, will have all sorts of expectations about all sorts of other things, and don't see that in fact that there are certain compromises to be made, and there are certain priorities to be chosen, and we all make our choices. I'm quite happy with my life of relative poverty. I've made my choices, and I'm at peace with that. I think so. Yeah, it's about that value clarification, right? What really matters. And if there are some things that are causing you significant discomfort about the scholarly life, I mean, Martha Nussbaum is quite good about this when she's thinking about sort of the Stoic account of emotions. Think about the emotional responses you have to situations, and that will tell you a lot about your beliefs, right? Your real beliefs. Yeah, because on that Stoic account, your emotions are reflections of the value judgments that you make. So if you're finding a particular situation really, really distressful, it's like that's an opportunity to go through a process of value clarification. And okay, what is it about this that I think I'm overvaluing or undervaluing? And it sounds as if Alberti has gone through this process himself. And the text that I was focusing on, the De Commodis, if you read it on its own, it's got all these jokes and it's quite entertaining. I mean, I think we should read it as if it is a work of comedy. But if you read it alongside his autobiography, where he also talks about having gone through some really quite serious periods of mental illness and depression, and having to step back from his studies altogether and go into isolation for extended periods because he suffered so much, I think it puts the text into a different light. And so there's a comic element to it, but there's also something there's a really quite serious narrative there as well about mental health. And then, as I say, a little later, he writes these works of Stoic inspired philosophical therapeutics. He's like, I've got myself into this hole, but I've also in the process gained all of these philosophical resources, and perhaps they can get me out of it. So I think there are so many different levels in which we can learn from what Alberti's doing.
Everyone, we're immersed deeply in this discussion. I understand that, but we're also 8 minutes over program. So I think in the interest of fairness to Laura, if people could hold their questions until the final session, which will already be finishing somewhat after time, then I think we can perhaps integrate them into the whole. I appreciate that there's a lot of interest in John's subject and a lot of passion perhaps as well, because our values have been implicated. And John's presentation, as ever, was just a model of clarity. And thank you for introducing this incredibly interesting text, John. So we do have some questions. Apologies to Victoria, apologies to Stephen, apologies to Massimo, apologies to Alexander. For the moment, perhaps we can make good on that debt later. But I do want to invite Laura, who's moved into a classroom because of the vicissitudes of the internet, to present her paper to us on Mary Astell and philosophy as a way of life. Laura is an assistant professor of philosophy at West Texas A&M. And as I say, her paper this morning is on a new figure for many of us in this discourse, Mary Astell. So Laura, please.
Yes, I am just trying to share my screen real quick. Slide. Okay, can everyone see this slide? Okay, great. So first of all, I'm really honored to be here. Thank you so much for asking me to be here. I consider myself somewhat of a novice in terms of PWL, so it's especially exciting for me to be here amongst so many well-established PWL scholars. Thank you for that. So this is what I think is a very simple paper about Mary Astell, who's an early modern philosopher. She's often called the first English feminist, and she's most widely known for her book. The full title is A Serious Proposal to the Ladies for the Advancement of Their True and Greatest Interests. The first edition came out in 1694, and it didn't really go over well, so she wrote another edition or a sequel to it in 1697, and those are the main texts that I will be drawing from today. One of the reasons I wanted to talk about Mary Astell is because there's really not a lot, if anything, on her as participating in the PWL tradition. When I was doing my research, I found one article, not even a book, just an article, which I will be using for this today. But she does direct her rhetoric and her logic and her philosophical discourse specifically towards the self-transformation of women. And there's a lot of work on Estelle in terms of rhetoric or feminism, especially after 1986. So Ruth Perry wrote this really fantastic book called The Celebrated Mary Estelle, and it was published in 86. And since then, the scholars of rhetoric and feminist scholars have really been doing a lot of great work on Estelle, but not many philosophers talk about her. And especially, as I said, there's really not much about her in terms of the PWL tradition. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. She provides rules for directing the mind. She provides rules for tempering the passions, combating custom, and of course, for the ultimate goal of self-transformation. So to talk about her, I want to use actually Matthew Sharp and Michael Yor's Tenniad paradigm that's in their excellent book, Philosophy as a Way of Life. I think this provides a really clear structure for drawing forth the PWL elements that are in Estelle's works here. So this is a table that, according to Sharp and Yor, quote, isolates some 10 features of philosophical activity which a PWL approach casts into visibility. So you can see the 10 features here, from philosophy as pedagogy to conceptions of the stage, of the sage. And in addition to this, they kind of categorize these into different levels. So whether it's at the pedagogical, practical level, all the way up to the normative level. And if you have questions about that, please direct them to the author of the book who is hosting this conference today. But remarkably, number 5, this inward turn, doesn't have a level attached to it because, according to our esteemed authors here, it's the founding premise of PWL, right? And everything else is working towards that change in people's deep set beliefs. So I am interpreting Estelle according to the ones that you can see I have bolded and underlined: intellectual exercises, spiritual exercises, critiques of non-philosophers, and this inward turn. Estelle begins her series proposal part 2 with a rejoinder to her readers. Quote, "Why won't you begin to think and no longer dream away your time in a wretched incogitancy?" End quote. The institution she proposed in Series Proposal Part 1, or SP1, which was a monastic retreat for women, did not come to fruition, and instead she offers a method for women to improve their education at home so that they may finally think. Most women at this time were denied a humanistic education, and they were seen as unfit for the study. Thus, Estelle created her own educational plan, and she bases this argument on universal reason, and she's drawing really strongly from Descartes here. She writes, quote, "All have not leisure to learn languages and pore on books, nor the opportunity to converse with the learned, but all may think and use their own faculties rightly and consult the master who is within them," end quote. So Estelle is part of what Sharp and Yor call this long history of philosophical thinkers, prescribing norms to train their students how to read, speak, write, dialogue, and remember. She participates in this tradition, particularly in terms of intellectual exercises and her rhetorical curriculum. Estelle directs her rhetorical program specifically towards women because men did not see women as fit for rhetorical educations for many reasons. They were not educated in the classics, they were not literate in Latin, and since rhetoric was based on knowledge of classical philosophy and literature, and thus the ability to read Latin, women were excluded from this tradition. So while her rhetorical curriculum is better understood in this category of philosophy as pedagogy, it is closely related to her intellectual exercises. So I just wanted to touch on that for a brief moment. For example, she refers to logic in rhetoric as natural logic and says that one does not need books to be rational. She tells her readers, quote, "I shall not send you further than your own minds to learn it. A good natural reason, after all, is the best director." Estelle's appeal to universal reason, that all humans have it and can use it, is the foundation for intellectual equality in her writing. She wrote a series proposal part 2 with the intent to provide these at-home exercises for readers, women, to practice specifically to amend their intellects, control their passions, and break free of the manacles of custom that kept them in servitude. This becomes a major point in her writings. In order to accomplish her goals, she then presents a method of thinking which she urges her readers to follow. Through this method, one can bring their passions and vices, including prejudices, under control. And through the curriculum, her readers will be more virtuous. If we reason correctly for Estelle, we will be more virtuous. And if we are virtuous, we are going to reason better. Virtue, Estelle writes, quote, consists in governing animal impressions and directing our passions to such objects and keeping them in such a pitch as right reason requires, end quote. In order to be virtuous, to direct our passions properly as reason requires, we must ensure that neither the will nor the understanding are what she calls diseased. Both must be aimed towards their proper objects, and it is ignorance, vice, custom, and prejudice that contribute to the diseases of these faculties. The proper object of understanding is truth, and the proper object of the will is the good. Understanding pertains to receiving and comparing ideas, while the will is, quote, the power of preferring any thought or motion, of directing them to this thing or that thing rather than to another, end quote. When the understanding is diseased, it lacks knowledge. This occurs through being fettered by prejudice, lack of consideration, and lack of careful examination. Thought can be volatile, subject to an overly active imagination, and therefore disposed to error. We must cultivate attention and examination to avoid false judgments, as well as, quote, vanity and arrogance, to impertinent prating of things we don't understand, end quote. These false judgments, stemming from want of consideration and examination, are the source of which she calls all irregularities of the will. The will becomes irregular when it's fettered by custom. Quote, as prejudice fetters the understanding, so does custom manacle the will, which scarce knows how to divert from a track which the generality around it take, and to which it has itself been habituated, end quote. Custom influences the will to become rebellious and inclines us to judge an action as right or wrong for no other reason than it's been deemed right or wrong by long use and sanctions of our forebears. The shadows of prejudice and custom mutually reinforce one another. For example, custom is used as an excuse to do evil, even if reason condemns such actions, and prejudice keeps the custom in place. To regulate the understanding, then, Estelle offers rules or her method of thinking, and these are an amalgamation of Descartes' rules presented in his discourse and the Port Royal logic. Similar to Descartes, for Estelle, erroneous judgments can be avoided if we just carefully follow a reliable method of thought. Her rules are particularly aimed at women, though. As she adapts these Cartesian rules, she also acknowledges that women were educated differently than the usual audience, and so she adds in bits of advice that she thinks that women would find particularly of use. For example, women need to guard against hastiness and lack of focus. So Estelle presents her 6 rules or intellectual exercises to correct the understanding, and you can see they're in this chart here. Rule 1 is to acquaint ourselves thoroughly with the question at hand, so that we have a distinct notion of our subject and the terms that we make use of. So we need to know what we're investigating. Rule 2 heeds us to focus. We must cut off all needless ideas and whatever has not a necessary connection to the matter under consideration. We must ensure that we're not distracted. Rule 3 instructs the readers to order our thoughts, beginning with the simplest and easiest objects, and we move up higher towards higher degrees of knowledge to more composed things. So we start with the simple and we move up to composites. And this is part of her theory that knowledge is gradual. Rule 4 advises readers to leave nothing unexamined and to consider anything that could add to knowledge and then to shut out what is foreign to it. And this is where she includes moral actions as well. This is the very woman-focused part. We need to figure out what is not only appropriate, but necessary depending on time, place, and circumstance. She also draws directly from Descartes' rules here, stating, quote, to this rule belongs that of dividing the subject of our meditations into as many parts as we can, and it shall be requisite to understand it perfectly. So this is actually an adoption of Descartes' second rule in his discourse, which he states very simply, divide the subject into as many parts as possible. Rule 5 tasks practitioners with always keeping the subject at hand to think closely and pertinently. And Rule 6 demands that the audience judge us no further than we perceive and don't take anything as truth that we do not know to be so. But there are cases where we do need to rest content with probability rather than certainty, or some cases where we have to act very urgently and then we simply do not have time to trace them to the bottom. But unless these cases arise, we should not presume truth until we have certain proof. These intellectual exercises, she says, guard us against the sophisms of the head and are meant to keep us from maintaining opinions that we know to be false, also known as prejudice. This means nothing, however, if we are subject to errors of the heart. The unregulated will never obeys the understanding. Chapter 4 of SP2 particularly addresses regulation of the will and the government of the passions. Though Estelle contends that the mind is not gendered, she does not forget the import of the body. It is women's embodied social conditions that keep them ensnared in ignorance and vice. Mind and body, she writes, must work together. Contemplation requires a governable body, a sedate and steady mind, and the body and mind do so reciprocally influence each other that we can scarce keep the one in turn if the other be out of it. We can no more disregard the body than we can prioritize body over mind. We have to govern the body, and there are some passions we cannot control, but we can control our will and our inclinations. So Estelle takes a very Cartesian-inspired view of passions here. She says they're perceptions that arise involuntarily as a result of its close intermingling with the human body. Also, like Descartes, passions for Estelle are not themselves bad and are in fact natural and unavoidable, and they can be pleasant and useful. But if left untempered, they can dysregulate the understanding. If they run rampant, they attack reason and confuse the will. So it's through virtue that consists in governing our passions that we really need to cultivate, and we need to direct our passions as reason demands through being virtuous. So the way to govern our passions consists of the virtue of temperance. It holds the mind, as Estelle says, between mirth and melancholy, serious without sourness, and cheerfulness with levity. But not all rational creatures are affected by passions in the same way. Our particular embodiment is relevant to the passions that affect us. Each of us is affected differently based on education, way of living, age, and bodily constitution. So we should also put forth an effort to know human nature in general and ourselves in particular. We have to place ourselves under a continual watch, and her rules of thinking are very useful for this. As Jacqueline Broad writes, quote, to achieve mastery over her passions, the female reader is advised simply to begin by focusing her attention. She is advised to withdraw herself from the hurry and noise of the everyday world and to immerse herself in a life of contemplation. Generosity is a particularly important passion for Estelle because corrupted generosity is the cause of what she calls most feminine vices. And these are things like pride and vanity, which in particular are corrupted generosity. This degradation of women is caused by being in a society where the custom is to mock and degrade them. Generosity is actually at the center of her program of moral development. For Estelle, like Descartes, generosity is not giving as we think of it today. It's a greatness of the soul, or it's a self-esteem or admiration of oneself. This is why she states in SP1 that the corrupted generosity is the source of these feminine vices. Pride and vanity are diseased versions of self-esteem and arise when self-esteem is unfounded or based on the wrong attributes. But when we value ourselves as worthy, when our wills and understanding are aimed at the right objects, and when we know that we are truly worthy of praise or blame, we can say we have a generous spirit. So in SP2, Estelle appeals to generosity specifically as a liberatory tool to throw off the shackles of custom. She states, quote, but a generous resolution and courageous industry are not only necessary to enable us to throw off sloth and to conquer the prejudices of education, authority, and custom, end quote. It also allows us to suffer through the inconveniences of living an unconventional life, which is the life that she led. Quote, but the author of our nature, to whom all the inconveniences we are liable to in this early pilgrimage are fully known, has endowed us with the principles sufficient to carry us safely through them all. One of these is generosity, which, so long as we keep it from degenerating into pride, is of admirable advantage to us in this matter, end quote. So if we have true self-esteem, which stems from regulating the will and the understanding, we need not worry about public opinion and social convention. Furthermore, since generosity stems from regulating the will, she recognizes, quote, that she has such a freedom or that she can direct her mind this way or that according to her own pleasure. She is therefore attentive to the fact that she does not have to continue on the conventional path that her forefathers and foremothers took. She might follow the dictates of her own natural reason instead, end quote. She is no longer subject to previous vices. In addition to intellectual exercises, Estelle provides certain meditative or contemplative exercises to improve the intellect or govern the passions. These meditative practices are comparable to the spiritual exercises described in Sharp and Yours Tiniad. A PWL hermeneutic asks, quote, does the philosophy prescribe exercises of meditation, recollection, contemplation, premeditation, examination of conscience, and so on and so forth, end quote. Estelle offers 2 meditative practices for her readers meant to provide foundational knowledge of the self. And just relating this back to the Sharp in your book, again, one of the things they say is that these meditative practices are meant to reveal non sequiturs that kind of become naturalized by custom. And that's what I see her meditative practices doing here. So Alice Sowell refers to Estelle's contemplative exercises in terms of 2 different strategies, the separatist strategy and the inward strategies, and both are meant to free women from the manacles of custom. So the separatist strategy was what she put forth in SP1, the retirement retreat, and that didn't go over as expected. So the inward strategy is what she's putting forth in SP2, and there are 2 teleological arguments for meditation here. The first are arguments for education, and these are about reforming the understanding. And the second are the arguments for variety, which are meant to stimulate the will, and this is what I'm focusing on. So she provides a passage for meditation which renders the following argument. Just as there is variety among bodies, so too is there variety among minds. All may think does not mean that all think in the same way or are capable of ascertaining the same truths. Variety in bodies brings beauty to the material world, and variety in minds brings beauty to the intellectual world. This variety allows us to be of mutual advantage to one another. We can't attend to all things in the physical world because we have limited skills, and the same is true for knowledge. Such limitations, Estelle states, are so that we will form community with one another. Additionally, physical and intellectual variety befit a complete adoration of God. An infinite God cannot be perfectly adored by a finite creature, but a variety of creatures, each with their own particular truths and talents, can love and adore God more completely together, attending to, quote, that variety of sublime truths of beautiful and wondrous objects, end quote, that each individual understanding is suited for. Awareness of why God has created such a variety of minds will prompt the meditator to think on the truth she is befitted to hold. Quote, if we are then convinced that there's some particular task allotted to us, our next business will be to inquire what it is. To know our own strength and neither to over nor underrate ourselves is one of the most material points of wisdom, end quote. Humans often blame our defects on the shallowness of reason at large, but then go above and beyond this to blame the creator for such shortcomings. Or we idolize ourselves by expecting adoration for our intellectual acuity. What we should do, however, is ascribe praise to human reason overall and lay the blame on our individual shortcomings. The arguments for variety reveal to us why we have such individual limitations in the first place, while the arguments for education reveal that all of mankind is rational. Awareness of when and why we are worthy of either praise or blame cultivates this generosity, this well-deserved self-esteem. Lack of awareness is what leads to pride and vanity. By meditating on the arguments for variety, women seek their own particular strengths and contemplate their places in God's creation, places not informed by social custom, but rather known by the master within them, which is their own reason. As Simone Webb writes, quote, once we contemplate the divine appropriately, we will find ourselves transformed, end quote. Estelle attends for the meditative exercises, intellectual exercises, and her new curriculum for women to free women from the enslavement in which custom and prejudice place them. Her disdain for custom truly is at the heart of her work. Her critique of custom and prejudice are, in effect, a critique of the average everydayness of a life that is not properly philosophically informed. Prejudice keeps one in ignorance, custom keeps one in vice. The practice of philosophy is a curative for both malignancies. Estelle's attack on prejudice and custom establishes that women are not naturally foolish, vapid, or prone to folly. Custom is the reason we value them, and that's referring specifically to men, too much, and ourselves too little. If we place any part of our worth in their opinion, and do not think ourselves capable of nobler things than the pitiable conquest of some worthless heart, end quote. While it is thought that men are more capable of wit and wisdom, and that women are naturally incapable of acting prudently and are necessarily determined to folly, such incapacities are acquired, not natural. From infancy, women lack certain advantages and are, quote, nursed up with these vices, which will hereafter be upbraided to them, end quote. Running constantly through her serious proposal, part 1, is Estelle's claim that, quote, the only differences between men and women and people in general are opportunity and inclination, and that the limitations which she wants to eliminate on women's advancement are based on errant opinion and willful ignorance, end quote. The stereotypical women who curled their hair, played at cards, gossiped over tea tables, dandled their lapdogs, were a result of misdirected ambition and improperly used intelligence. They were wedded to malicious custom just as surely as the social conventions that kept them in place. It is custom as well that sustains bad marital decisions, which she writes a lot about. For example, women often choose husbands based on what only resembles love and honor. Men charm women, appealing to their vanity, and women, quote, will reckon it but gratitude to think well of him who values her so much, end quote. Self-esteem and love of the good degenerate into pride and self-love, creating she who, quote, will now very glibly swallow down his poison because 'tis presented in a golden cup, end quote. She will accept proposals to her own disadvantage if they but appeal to her vanity. Vanity, self-love, pride, all remain a vicious shroud cinched closed by custom. Estelle writes, quote, ignorance and a narrow education lay the foundation of vice, and imitation and custom rear it up. Custom, that merciless torrent that carries all before. 'Tis custom, therefore, that tyrant custom, which is the grand motive of all those irrational choices which we daily see made in the world. Quote. Those who accepted this inferiority of women without acknowledging why women were in such straits, quote, were even blinder than those they condemned to darkness, end quote. Of course, she writes, a woman who is taught to value herself on nothing but her clothes and to think she's very fine when well accoutred, will lay out her industry and money on such accomplishments. Casting off custom and establishing a rational ability common to all is liberating for women who are otherwise entrapped in misogynistic social structures. Her critique of custom is more than a well-written kvetch. In this critique of average everydayness, Estelle shows her unique systematic philosophy, her teleological views, and her method for freedom through self-transformation. This inward turn, the heart of PWL, pertains to, quote, focused philosophical attention on one's own beliefs, attitudes, and effects, end quote. Ultimately, Estelle's philosophical system, as presented in a series proposal, shows one how to live. Each part of her curriculum, from the intellectual exercises to meditation to the creation of the curriculum itself, has a liberatory effect on women, and this liberation comes from the self-transformation that arises from philosophical practice. Awareness that the oft-attributed flaws of women are not natural, but rather acquired through custom and prejudice, puts women on the path to developing their intellect and regulating their will. Self-transformation becomes a real possibility when they realize that they do not have to be fettered by vice and ignorance. In particular, the virtue of generosity drives this self-transformation and freedom. As Simone Webb writes, and this is the one article I found on Estelle and PWL, quote, Estelle links philosophy as a transformative practice to women in particular, end quote. Estelle crafts a complex and freeing systematic philosophy to critique custom, which upholds average everydayness of the non-philosophical life. Custom, we could say, is the progenitor of vice, particularly those feminine vices. This not only leads to poor decisions, especially in terms of marriage, but also the degeneration of women's very selves. Custom is harmful to women as ethical agents. However, one can do the inner work to free herself from this tyrant. Estelle proffers her women-specific curriculum to do just that, as her intellectual exercises and meditative practices show. While all may benefit from her philosophical cure, it is intended specifically for women to use, for they are the ones that are ethically stunted, she's talking about, by these customary social conventions. Not only then does Estelle's work showcase key elements of PWL, but it also shows a gendered use of PWL. So hopefully this piece demonstrates a few salient points of consideration for future PWL scholarship. Most evident is the conclusion, which I think is true, that Mary Estelle rightly deserves inclusion in PWL literature. There are, in addition to this, more subtle consequences of such thought. To begin with, Estelle demonstrates that PWL can be gendered and can be written for certain demographic groups. Simone Webb queries, quote, are philosophical ways of life implicitly gendered? Do women face obstacles to practicing philosophical modes of living? Is the philosophical existence desirable for women, end quote. These are important questions for the PWL movement, and a study of Estelle shows one way someone answers them. These questions can be expanded to include other social considerations, such as whether or not PWL is racist or ableist, and so forth. If we commit to the PWL claim that philosophy as practiced is transformative, then we must look at the interactions between institutions, including social traditions, and obstacles to transformation, and direct philosophical modes of practice to overcome such impediments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. Just let people express their gratitude virtually. What a wonderful presentation on an incredibly interesting author who I confess I'd known very, very little about. And so thank you personally. Others will also have questions and hands as well as claps. So now would be the time.
Massimo.
Massimo, then Judy.
Yes, thank you, Laura. The rule number 6, I believe that you mentioned, says something about, let me pick up my notes, judge no further than we perceive. So setting aside a discussion about whether we can actually have knowledge and as opposed to just probabilities, and I consider myself firmly in the latter camp, does that reference to perception, however, put us into a sort of empiricist camp in a sense? I mean, why just perception as opposed to reason?
So in terms of the empiricist camp versus the rationalist camp, just a little background here. Estelle is definitely more of a rationalist in the Cartesian tradition. And, you know, at this time, kind of the big division was Locke versus Descartes. And she, I mean, her remarks on Locke are so wicked. It's just, she really hates Lockean philosophy. She really is not a fan of that kind of empiricism. But I think specifically she's referring to the fact that there are simply some things that we cannot know. And, you know, kind of drawing from the Descartes, I mean, she really is saying like the will should not outstrip the intellect here, because this is where we find ourselves kind of living a life of vice. This is where we make our mistakes. So after we've analyzed all of the parts of everything, right? After we've kind of moved from simple to composite, we really shouldn't go beyond that. And this is where she then turns to, and it's kind of interesting turn for someone who seems so radically feminist. She was a high church Tory and very, very conservative. And this is where she specifically turns to the authority of the church. And she says, there are some things we can't know, especially divine truths. And this is where we need the clergy to reveal them to us. And we can't try to make knowledge claims about them.
Judy?
Yeah, so thanks, Laura. That was fascinating. Can you give us a bit of a sense of how influential Estelle was in say, her generation and the next one after that? Because as I said in my comment, I think in some ways she seems to have been about 100 years ahead of the curve.
I think that she was not super influential after her time. I mean, and I think this has to do with how very radical she was, specifically, and her first proposal, I mean, she was mocked relentlessly for her proposal for a religious monastery. And a lot of her thought, I mean, she had like really brilliant religious thought, which I'm not super familiar with, but she was in correspondence with John Norris, and they published a book together, but a lot of her writings were published anonymously, and I think that led to her lack of influence. And I think at the time, John Norris also overshadowed her, even though a lot of his thought was developed because of his conversation with her.
Other questions? Can I just push you a little bit on poor old Locke, Laura, who so often seems to be on the receiving end of harsh judgments, and it seems that he's also on the receiving end of them from Estelle. And like Massimo, I think there are some resonances in these Cartesian rules at certain points with things that Locke is trying to develop in his little book on the conduct of the understanding, for example. So yeah, could you just talk through, I mean, is it simply that she feels herself a Cartesian and that she feels that Locke's approach to epistemology is therefore kind of, you know, flawed in a fundamental sense? It starts in the wrong places and proceeds in the wrong way. So is it?
That's part of it. So part of it is that she does consider herself a Cartesian. And at this time, this use of Descartes was actually very liberating for women. This focus on a disembodied mind was really telling women like, hey, we do have reason. We're not necessarily tied to these social conventions. And the fact that he was writing in French at times, and when women were being cut out of education because they did not read Latin, I mean, that was really just astounding for them. So part of it is that kind of feminist attachment to Descartes, but she also says that like Locke's theory of tabula rasa, this kind of empiricism, makes reason essentially a matter of custom or social convention. Because Locke says that, you know, we get our ideas from what is around us. So if women are trapped by this kind of social convention and by this custom, she thinks that it just continues to keep women trapped in convention and in custom. It continues to keep women silly and foolish and vapid, versus the kind of universal reason that Descartes offers with his rationalism. So that's one part of her criticism, is specifically what his empiricism does to women, or the consequences of it. Another are his views on property, because women couldn't own property. So she says if Locke is correct, and that property does contain somewhat of our personhood, or it is some kind of, if the acorn tree or the oak tree and the acorns really are some kind of mystical expression of our personhood, then this would mean that women are actually never fully able to develop and express their personhood because they couldn't own property.
Thank you so much. We have a question from Chris that in the chat. But Chris, do you want to voice that for the sake of the
Sure, yes.
similitude of our discussion, the reality of it, I guess, rather than just doing it through text?
Sure, yeah. I didn't want to ask you directly because, you know, you're presenting on Mary Estelle and not Wollstonecraft, but I wonder if you saw any connections between the two, because of course there's the feminist concern that's overlapping, but my current research is to plow through Wollstonecraft because I think there's quite a lot of philosophy as a way of life there, including specific practices that one should undergo. Maybe a question related to that, but would be more direct to your presentation, is those rules, those Cartesian rules to sort of start the intellectual method, those definitely seem to be philosophy as a way of life to me. I was wondering if there are any others that you found in Estelle, and if there are any of them that were on more the practical side and less that intellectual purification that's so important to Descartes.
Okay, so as to Wollstonecraft, I'm glad you didn't ask me directly because I don't know. As to the second part of your question, are you saying, are there more rules in her work that are more practically oriented?
Yes, for instance, you know, one of the famous Stoic practices is that you sort of review your day before you go to bed, and that helps you think about where you've gone wrong and what you can do the next day. That's very much about what you'll actually do that next day. And it's a little more on the personal or behavioral side, whereas you're absolutely right how close she's following Descartes there, but those rules seem largely to be clearing out the intellectual confusions, getting rid of some customary ideas so we have better ideas that lead to virtue. But yeah, are there any other practices and ones that would be more practical or more directly working on our virtue and not going through the intellectual route to then improve our virtue as a sort of secondary step?
Right, that's a good question. Thank you for that. So I think part of the way that you can answer your question is her prescription for these meditative exercises. These are what I would call, I mean, Hadot distinguishes between the therapy of the word and then something like Marcus Aurelius and his reflections, which are the therapy of writing. And I think what she's doing is definitely more therapy of the word, where it's the help of these logical argumentations with very striking imagery that are supposed to stir the will or the intellect in some particular way. So I think that's one of the prescriptions that she's giving her readers, is to really meditate on these specific teleological arguments. Not only is that going to help them break free from the manacles of custom, but it's also going to allow them to meditate on God, which she talks a lot about in her serious proposal. And this meditation on God is meant to help us kind of cultivate these Christian virtues. And this is a tie to something very practical, which is her rhetoric. So she talks about the logic, and then she talks about her rhetoric, which is super practical. It's essentially how to talk to and relate to other people. She focuses more on serma, which is private parlor conversation and letter writing, than the very, I think it's contentio, like the contentious public debates. And she critiques those debates, and she says they're focused on victory, not truth. She says that traditional rhetoric is a complete misuse of logic, and it's a complete misuse of reason, and that women are naturally better at rhetoric for a variety of reasons, in part because they are better conversationalists naturally, but they're also pushed to uphold very specific kind of Christian virtues, which we can gain more knowledge of through these kind of teleological meditations. So it's really in her rhetorical curriculum that you find her practical rules of how to conduct behavior towards other people. And she talks a lot about compassion towards the audience, and how when we speak to people, we need to realize that if one person suffers, the rest of us suffer, and how that affects our treatment of others, and so on and so forth. So I don't know if that's a complete answer, but it's maybe the start of an answer.
Oh, I think it's great. Thank you. That's exactly the kind of stuff I was looking for. Thanks.
Okay, thank you again, Laura. And let's as it were finish this session, and then invite those who wish to stay around and discuss the entire session, because I think there's so many overlaps between the three papers that are really worth sticking around for and discussing. But this is the moment of the soft exit. And again, thank you to Laura for such an excellent paper.
So maybe we can bring in some of the people who had questions earlier. And I'm thinking maybe Victoria, because I think you missed out earlier, Victoria. Do you want to, I think you had a question for John, is that right?
Yes, correct. Yes, I did. I was wondering, it seemed to me that that Alberti was saying that it's in the doing of the thing that you find its meaning and even become its meaning. And I was thinking of the famous Bhagavad Gita, that most well-known part of the Mahabharata, the Hindu scriptures, Hindu epic, where the great warrior Arjuna refuses to fight, like Achilles, refuses to fight. But Achilles refuses to fight because he's insulted, he's pissed off, he's angry, famously angry. Whereas Arjuna sits down in the middle of the battle because he can't find a reason for war. He can't find any meaning in it. And the god Krishna comes down and debates with him and makes the point that you have to do your duty without regard for victory, or say for gain or loss, or victory or defeat. And that sort of goes with what Xiao Junding had said, as the Chinese saying goes, being a scholar is of no use. In other words, it's not an instrument, it's the thing itself. Maybe that's what that Chinese saying means, I don't know. But I was wondering, it's more of a comment than a question, John, but I was wondering if how you would respond to that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, I'm not sure that he's directly thinking about the process, although you could say that virtue is an activity, so there's a sense in which there's a process, there's a focus on process rather than any kind of further external reward. I mean when he's talking about the doing of things, he's talking about he's reflecting on sort of the doing of the scholarly life. his kind of hard-won experience. I think that's really to do with challenging his expectations, right? So he goes into this certain way of life, expecting that it will deliver certain things. And it's only by actually doing it and confronting the reality of what it does and doesn't deliver that he then finds out that actually, you know, there's a fundamental incompatibility here between the thing that I desire and this path that I've gone down. So either you change the path or you change your desire, right? So that seems to be the thing that he's taking from his kind of sort of, you know, lived experience. So it's that challenge between different values and what different situations or different contexts, you know, might actually be able to offer.
Thank you.
So, Jia John, is that how you pronounce it? Did you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you, Judy, and also, I think I'd like to make some clarification about the Chinese saying. Actually, I think there are also very controversial debates about the utility or the usefulness of the scholarship, and also another very famous Chinese philosopher also proposes that the similarly uselessness of the actually he's talking about philosophy. The similarly uselessness of philosophy is actually the largest utility. So that kind of some dialectic interpretation of the utility of philosophy, and some people also try to extend it to more general scholarship. And also I'm very interested with today's three speeches. I think they are very inspiring for me. Actually, we are doing some kind of philosophical practice in China. I think maybe Massimo is also familiar with Marinov. He's doing this kind of philosophical practice job, and actually we are, we will read a lot of those books, and also some other translated articles of his, and also for many of the speakers today, we have read many of your papers, and we are very grateful, and we have learned a lot from all of your papers, and also we are trying to do this kind of work or research from maybe sometimes from the philosophy of life, and also the PWL way. So we are thinking that maybe we can try to get connected in the future, maybe in different ways, and also I think also although I propose in the chat room that the controversial Chinese saying, actually for myself, I believe that scholarship is very, because I am also a Chinese philosophical researcher, although I'm right now visiting the US in the US University of South Florida. So I chose to participate in this workshop rather than watching the football game. So it means that to me this is more present for me, and also I noticed that some people might think that the scholars do their job alone, especially for the philosophers. But also we can see from this workshop that actually we have a community, and we can communicate with each other, which is very interesting, and also make it is a very good way and a very valuable way to spend our time. But we can still, we have to acknowledge that, such as when John just, I think, mentioned that, so for example, it maybe to do this kind of scholarship, we cannot get some money or some pleasure or some other fame and things like that. But we can compare this situation with the football players. most of them can get all of the three things. So it kind of seems unfair to us. We have spent so much time and so much efforts in our study and in our work. But some people might wonder, what we have get from this kind of thing, these things. And also, sometimes we will talk to our students. We will some teachers might persuade their students to continue their scholarships or to do the research job, but but for me, sometimes I will so I will tell them that you have to consider more completely whether you can get that kind of pleasure in your intellectual activity, whether you think that that was something that really mattered for you. So that's what I can I want to share with all of you, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Xiaojun.
Yes, thank you so much.
Massimo, did you want to go?
Yeah, I have a question for John. So as much as Alberti is certainly a fascinating character, I wonder how much of what he was talking about was actually a reflection of his own personal situation, maybe even pathology, as opposed to sort of a general thing. I mean, you're a scholar, I'm a scholar. Do you actually recognize that kind of portrait? Because I know a lot of people who are perfectly happy of being scholars, accept the trade-offs. It doesn't bother, but they're not Stoics. They're just people that make a decision about priorities in life. We could be talking in the same way about a musician or a painter or even an athlete, unless they become very famous and very, but those are the exceptions. Most of the times they don't. So you just make decisions based on your priorities and values, and those are not necessarily the ones that are shared by society at large. So I wonder, in other words, to what extent do you think that is what we heard is personal about Alberti as opposed to sort of a general situation? And also, of course, the other obvious question is, okay, that was scholarship 5 centuries ago. What about now?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So, I mean, I think, I certainly know people who thoroughly enjoy the scholarly life that they're committed to, and are are doing exactly what they dreamed they would. And I also know a lot of people that are very grumpy and that moan a lot and constantly complain about the neoliberalization of higher education and the drop in real world earnings and the precarity of early career researchers and all the rest of it. And all of this, you've heard it all as well. So, I mean, not everyone is grumpy and disaffected for sure. And I certainly know lots of people that do thoroughly enjoy. I mean, there could be a generational element to this as well, right? Every young generation says it's much harder for them than it was for the previous generation. But I mean, that seems like a perpetual truth, right? Rather than anything about any given situation. So, I mean, I think it echoes a number of things that are going on right now, for sure, but I don't think it's the universal condition. And the reason why that would fit with Alberti's analysis is because it all depends on the motivations and the values that people have when they go into this. And as you say, some people have rightly accepted the trade-offs that they've decided to make. I mean, as an aside, I know someone. I don't know particularly well. He's not a philosopher, I should add, but very well educated, went to a very elite university. Many of his friends went off to become doctors and surgeons, and he goes off, has an academic career, becomes a professor, is as successful as an academic could be, and yet he's constantly complaining that his surgeon friends from university are better paid than him and are more highly respected. And it's like, well, you could have done that too, mate, if you wanted, but you chose not to. Right. So I think if we're all comfortable with our choices and the priorities we've made, and I'm hopefully most of us here are. I mean, as to the point about whether this is just Alberti's pathology, which is also a really interesting question. One thing I'll say about him, sort of a biographical fact about him, is he came from a relatively old, wealthy banking family, but he was born illegitimately, and his father died when he was relatively young. He was supposed to have a small inheritance as the illegitimate son to keep him going, but other members of the family denied him that inheritance. So he really was the adjunct teacher scrabbling around looking for the next teaching job because he was broke. And he also felt that he'd suffered this injustice, right? And he should have had this inheritance that would have enabled him to live this joyous Aristotelian life of leisurely contemplation. And he never got it, right? So that's part of the biographical story of Alberti that means this issue of, you know, why can't I make some money whilst also living the life of a scholar is so uppermost in his own mind. I mean, like many of us, he's got to pay the rents.
Thanks, John. I want to underscore the importance of what Jean was saying about building a network, which is obviously one of the purposes behind making this event possible. And one of the things I want to flag just for tomorrow at this time, one of the things that I know Eli and I would like to discuss is the possibility of thinking about a journal for philosophy as a way of life. I just wanted to ask a question before Eli, and now I can see Lucas, to Laura and to Michael about variety, which comes up, I think, in different ways in both of your talks. I mean, some of the depictions of unhappiness, you know, for example, stultitia in Seneca, it's a kind of variety. It's, you know, now today I'm doing this, tomorrow I'm doing that. I'm always busy, I'm never happy, I'm never doing anything properly. We as scholars, I think, can perhaps sometimes feel this in our own fields, but I think people outside of academia also feel it, including Serenus in this text. And yet there seems also to be another kind of variety or kinds. So can you talk to both Laura and Michael with the spectator novus idea about this idea of variety as even a meditative theme, but also the variety as in openness. If I could invite you both to say anything that might come to mind at this moment.
Well, I guess if I can jump in, I think, there seems to be an apparent contradiction because, I mean, the Stoics, people like Seneca, are writing treatises on constancy, right? De constantia. It's supposed to be being always the same, no matter what the circumstances of life might come up with, is a very important Stoic idea, right? And I'm not sure that, as far as I know, in ancient thought, that's very often thematized, this idea that a wide variety of different views, for instance, might be conducive to discovering the truth. Offhand, that sounds to me more like a modern idea than an ancient one. Although it also brings to mind that saying of Nietzsche, which Hadot was very fond of citing, which says that what ancient philosophy does is it provides an experimental workshop where we can see the results of attempts to transform ourselves and better ourselves throughout history. And Hadot was always big on promoting eclecticism, because he thought that one thing that Greco-Roman philosophy had to offer was, with its 6 philosophical schools, they were likely to appeal to 6 basic types of people. And he saw no reason why we couldn't pick and choose from all these philosophical schools, precisely because most of us are a combination of these 6 basic types of people.
So for Estelle specifically, for variety, there's a unity to the variety, right? This is part of what it means to have a teleological argument, and you see this in the argument on variety, but even the argument on education. And everything essentially for Estelle leads up to this love of God, right? And the virtue of this love for God that we have to have, and the love of God that we are supposed to contemplate. So there's that unity to the variety there. But I also just think, like, thinking non-Estelle, when we think of things like variety as a spice of life, but we don't just want to stay stagnant people, right? We want to expose ourselves to new things and we want to be very open-minded, but we also shouldn't allow ourselves to be consistently and constantly distracted on everything. And I think this idea of a unity to variety can also be just very helpful for day-to-day living. Like even in my scholarship, I study lots of kinds of things, but there's something that is a kind of underlying unity to them that gives a stability and keeps me from being kind of scholastically or intellectually flighty. So maybe even just personally looking at variety as something that can have a telos could be helpful for living a good philosophical life.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks, Michael. Okay, Eli has been waiting patiently. And then Luke.
Thanks, Matt. This is a question for all panelists, trying to build off Massimo's reflections there. And I was just thinking back to or actually all three papers on this point. I think one theme that's kind of been implicit in this, but we haven't fully unpacked, is the difference between the scholarly philosophical way of life and to have a position at the university, be a professor of philosophy, which obviously for those of us who read Hadot thoroughly, he has ambiguous feelings about with the rise of the medieval university, same with Julius Stamansky and many other PWL scholars. So to throw out a kind of clearly easy question, I was just thinking about how much is this life of, if we're trying to value the scholarly way of life that Alberti's talking about, how much is that capable within the parameters of the university today? So I understand it's a Stoic position and it's going to say it's capable everywhere, right? But if we pay attention to something like what Estelle is pointing to, clearly I'm paying some apologetics for the complainers here. How do the conditions of our life, do those really at the end of the day help us clear our intentions and recognize what's in our control or not? Or do they throw enough stuff at us that it's either a challenge to overcome or something of value? Like basically, does the university really contribute to the way of life part and to that scholarly way of life part? Or at best, does it provide Stoic challenges to overcome? You get what I'm meaning here? Because I think there's a distinction to be made, especially, of course, in the Renaissance humanists with their, shall we say, not very great view of the chairs, you know, if we can remember Petrarch here on how he feels about those. And this is just open to all. In the case of Mike, I'm thinking about just in a very practical sense of, you know, if we're returning to this kind of new and present perception, does university practice and even the way we teach students in classrooms really afford opportunities to help people re-engage, both with the kind of novelty of life, with kind of present day, and with the challenges to kind of live meaningfully? Again, I'm throwing an easy question with simple answers that I expect you in, you know, 3 sentences to give me.
Right. Yeah. Well.
Can I just, actually my question was very close to Eli. If I could just connect to what he said.
You can, Lucas. It already sounds to me, Eli, like a rather difficult question, but Lucas, please.
No, I mean just to elaborate further, because I was also wanting to comment on this topic about, well, you know, whether a scholar's life can or cannot be led in a philosophical way, and what is the deal if a scholar can actually be happy with their research. What comes to mind to me in that case, and I think Eli has put it very clearly, is that there's an issue that goes beyond, you know, the individual experience of someone that may actually manage to, you know, lead a fulfilled life as a scholar and do exactly what he wants to do, and so on and so forth. That's one thing. The other thing is to question if the structure of the university itself is favorable or not to leading life philosophically, and whether this, and sure, someone might be able to do that within the context of the university, but that doesn't mean that it helps. It can do quite the contrary. And I think Hadot himself will often point out and suggest not only that he has some view in that sense, that the universities today somehow move further away from this perspective of the philosophy as a way of life, because they teach philosophy only as a systematic discourse, and in a way that you don't really think about its applications to one's own life. But, and I would think he also, I think I remember he also quoting at some point, but even if he doesn't, it's just irrelevant, other figures that point out to this structural problem like Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, or what have you. It seems to be a recurrent theme to question, you know, does the structure of the university favors leading a philosophical way of life, or do we do it in spite of it, or maybe only outside of it? So yeah, just this point.
So
okay, well,
let's go to the three speakers this morning, and I'd also like to invite Marta, who hasn't yet spoken, if she feels comfortable when the time comes to come in, because I know that she's done work obviously around many of these questions as well.
I can just say something very quickly, because I was also I also had some a similar question in mind, so I would just join this group of, I don't know, frustrated people, frustrated scholars, I don't know, frustrated with the academy. I was reflecting on what John said, or on what Alberti suggests, that leading a successful scholarly life, or fulfilling scholarly life, essentially depends on your telos, or your motivation in doing it. But what if you're just, you decided, you made this life choice with a certain telos in mind, and then what you have in return, what you're asked to do, is just might have chosen a career, having knowledge and contemplation in mind, a life of leisure dedicated to wisdom, yeah, and then you end up having no time at all even to read, because you spend your whole day, your whole life actually fulfilling bureaucracies, or writing projects, or writing articles, when exactly you have nothing to say because you haven't read, because you didn't have time. I mean, I think you are all familiar with this kind of problem, and I wonder if you, John, as a scholar, or Alberti, as somebody who has thoroughly thought about this, if he has a solution to this problem. I mean, how do you find time to have a fulfilling scholarly life if you have to be a scholar, basically? And something I should have said before, thank you, all of you, for the wonderful presentations until now. It's been a wonderful event. Thank you, especially to Matthew for organizing
it. Okay, I mean, I'm happy to go first.
Yep.
So yeah, lots of interesting questions there. I mean, one thing that I mean, as Marta has just said, and that we all know all too well, and that Alberti stresses in his text, is you need time, right? You need time to read if you're going to do this kind of work. And so whether your actual material conditions of existence in your university post give you that space to read or not is obviously the most important question. And I think, to be honest, that ranges hugely from institution to institution. I can certainly think of a post I had at one distant moment in my past in an institution whose name I never mention out loud, where the conditions were absolutely horrific. In my current post, I am relatively content, and I do have, I think, enough space that I need. Obviously, there's plenty of pointless bureaucracy, that goes without saying, but I have enough space to be able to do the things that I'm keen to do. But I'm well aware that that's not true of every academic post, for sure. And I know that from my own kind of hard-won experience in other posts. I mean, and again, I mean, picking up a comment that Massimo made earlier, and he says he knows plenty of people that are very content. Well, people at a certain level of seniority in a certain type of institution are incredibly content because they've got very good working conditions. I mean, I live in Oxford. I mean, and there are people here who are fellows at All Souls College in Oxford who receive a reasonable salary with no responsibilities whatsoever. All Souls College has no students, right? You are just a researcher.
John.
you're just a researcher in a college next to one of the best libraries in the world. I mean, and that's it, right? I mean, but of course, not many people get that gig. So yeah, I fully accept the point. The material conditions of what we're actually operating in are fundamental. I mean, I could say a lot more about how I kind of manage my own time, but then we might kind of fall into becoming a bit of a therapy group. But I'm more than happy to have that discussion on another occasion.
Mike, did you want to jump in? You started before. Apologies.
Oh, well, I just wanted to say that, yeah, of course, Pierre Hadot is constantly harping on the fact that philosophy departments are basically, at least he thought so, factories for producing more philosophy professors. And I think that although he didn't say it by this word, by this name, I think what he was mainly concerned about is the commodification of knowledge. That if you turn being a philosophy professor into a 9-to-5 job, that's not a good thing. I remember when I was got my first philosophy job in Paris, and I was all excited and thrilled, and I went out with a colleague after a recent hire, and we sat down, we were going to have dinner, and I started talking philosophy, and my colleague stopped and she said, "Oh, no shop talk. It's after 5 o'clock." So no, okay, that's not the way that I wanted my life to live. I wanted to live my life that's not the gig I signed on for. But on the other hand, so there is this very serious problem that universities are structurally not set up to promote philosophy as a way of life. They tend often to make it a kind of a parlor game that one indulges in until 5 o'clock, and then one goes home and forgets all about it. On the other hand, if one has a little luck and one can get to the point where one can design and teach one's own courses, then of course one can teach philosophy as a way of life. And that has been, I've only been able to do that over the last few years, and it's been, I think, the most rewarding part of my life to teach in various institutions, students who often haven't come across this kind of an attitude to philosophy before, and to see the fascinating results that I get. So that's, in other words, I think if I were to overgeneralize, probably, I think that philosophical universities are intrinsically and basically inimical to philosophy as a way of life. But if one manages to get on the inside, one can be a sort of a secret agent and undermine them from within, to a certain extent.
The philosopher as secret agent. Laura?
Yeah, I am gonna give multiple parts because there was no one question. There were 3 comments with questions buried in them. So I think Eli asked something about teaching students PWL and if the classroom setting was conducive to that. And I don't think it is. Philosophy takes time, right? That's something that's been mentioned. It takes a long time to do and to think about. And if we want it to be transformative, that takes time too. And I don't think that's possible in 15 weeks. I don't think that's possible in 50 to 75-minute sessions. It's not possible. Our students are usually first gen, underprepared, work full-time jobs, have a lot of stuff going on, and they see it as a gen ed. And all of this, I think, is very inimical to teaching students about philosophy as anything other than just an elective or just a professionalized kind of topic that they're learning. Now, there are ways to get around that, right? There are always ways to get around these things. And that just depends on what you teach and how you teach it and the kinds of assignments that you give. I think this is when pedagogy becomes incredibly important. If we want our students to be instilled with these kind of PWL values, then it's just, how are we teaching them? What are we doing in the classroom? How are we relating to them? So that's my answer to one question. And so far as we talk about institutions overall, I mean, I tend to agree with the other speakers and their responses here. I mean, institutions seem to be fundamentally inimical to philosophy as a way of life. And for me, at least, I have to do a lot of mental separation between myself living philosophically as a philosopher and myself as a philosophy professor. Yes, those two things overlap, but as a philosophy professor, like, the university often asks me to do things that I ethically and fundamentally disagree with. I had to close the door, by the way, and answer this question because I'm at the university right now, which is very telling. And I've been thinking a lot actually about the ways that working in academia instills vices within us, much like Mary Estelle is talking about. Custom and social convention actually ethically harm women by instilling vices in them. I think academia does this to us a lot. I think it really takes us more away from virtue than we want to admit and pushes us more towards vice, even in terms of overwork, right? I mean, I think that's absolutely a vice. I think a lot of the stuff that it asks us to do could be very ethically harmful to us. And I guess that's just part of working in the capitalistic commodification world that we live in today. So that's my response for institutions. But I also want to say that I think of something that Marcus Aurelius wrote in his meditation, and Hadot talks about this in Inner Citadel, which is to turn the obstacle upside down. So it's really easy to think about things getting in the way of living a philosophical life, but that's just life. Lots of things get in the way of living a philosophical life. And Aurelius says, like, we have to turn the obstacles upside down. And it's kind of cliche, but he says we have to see the obstacles as opportunities. So I think in those terms, the institution is no better or worse than anything else that gets in the way of living a philosophical life. It's another obstacle, and we have to see it as an opportunity, not necessarily as something that stops us from doing this.
Thanks so much, Laura, for those comments, and to everybody. I think Michael's clapping, or is that a hand, Mike?
That was an applause for an excellent response by Laura.
Absolutely. It might be also, a good note to finish on, because we are rather over. Tomorrow we can also continue exactly these kinds of discussions, which are certainly what I was hoping would emerge from bringing people together and sharing experiences, and also obviously so much knowledge. Thank you so much to Michael. Thank you so much to John. Thank you so much to Laura. Tomorrow we've got another, I think, amazing program to look forward to, including Marta, who's here. Stephen, I think, had to depart. But yeah, it's going to be, I think, a terrific day. And of course, Eli is also still here as well, who's, my partner in crime in various ventures, and I'm always looking forward to hearing him. So thanks again so much. And let's leave it there, and let's rejoin things tomorrow. Have a good afternoon, evening, morning, whatever it may be for you wherever you are, and see you tomorrow. Bye.